I think we are able to start. So my name's Ian Markham. I'm the Dean and President of Virginia Theological Seminary. And in these extraordinary times, our traditional convocation where we gather on the campus is not really an option. We have to instead gather virtually. But the experience, I can assure you, will be rich and will be an opportunity for growth and development. I'm really pleased that we have Professor Gary Dorrien, who has kindly pre-recorded his talk for us today to ensure the best possible audio quality for everybody. But he's also here with us, so he'll have the privilege of listening to his own presentation before he'll also have the privilege of answering questions on that presentation. Professor Dorian is the Reinhold Niebuhr Professor of Social Ethics at Union Theological Seminary and Professor of Religion at Columbia University. He teaches in the areas of social ethics, theology, and the philosophy of religion. Dr. Dorian is a distinguished author of 20 books and over 300 articles that range across the fields of social ethics, philosophy, theology, political economics, social and political theory, religious history, cultural criticism, and intellectual history. Professor Cornel West describes him as the preeminent social ethicist in North America today, and Frederick Ferre called him a superstar interpreter of modern religious thought. Dr. Dorian is currently on the third volume of his trilogy on the Black social gospel, A Darkly Radiant Vision, the Black social gospel in the Shadow of King. Prior volumes in this trilogy are The New Abolition, which earned an award, and Breaking White Supremacy, which also earned an award. He's also written on social democracy in the making and imagining democratic socialism, political theology, Marxism, and social democracy. Let me just say, I first heard Professor Dorian speak at the American Academy of Religion, the Society of Anglican Theologians, I think it was, and I remember being so impressed with the sheer breadth of and the way in which of reading and the way in which it had all been so digested that you felt you were in the presence of a true masterful interpreter of trend and direction. And it really is an honor to have him with us today. So please sit back and let's hear Professor Dorian speak on the Black social gospel, Crises of Our Moment, and the struggle for justice.
Dear friends at Virginia Theological Seminary, I am deeply grateful to President Ian Markham and the faculty for the honor of speaking at your fall convocation. For many years, I have admired the theological scholarship of Ian and the VTS faculty, especially Catherine Sonderegger. Last year, I realized that I had lost track of Altagracia Perez-Bullard, and I was thrilled to discover that she has joined your faculty. If you are an Episcopalian and you care about the future of theological education, this school has to be important to you because it is our bellwether seminary. When Ian sent the invitation, I was delighted to think that I would speak about Anglican things. I speak all the time, and it's a very rare occasion that anyone asks me to talk about Anglicanism. But we are bombarded with crises piled on each other and compounding each other, which must be my subject. We have lived with crises of anti-Black racism and economic injustice throughout our nation's history. We confront an ecological crisis that will not wait for a better time. And today we are immersed in a pandemic that is intertwined with these other crises. The world changed last winter with a stunning, sweeping brutality, throwing us into the threatening strangeness that is now our daily bread. COVID-19 ripped through Asia and Europe, leaving a devastating trail of death. Italy reeled from it, And in New York City, we wondered fearfully, will we be ravaged like Italy? Soon, New York was worse than Italy. The virus overwhelmed New York hospitals and piled up bodies in makeshift morgues. It surged north, south, and west across the nation, worse than any nation, exposing that the USA was and is less prepared than any comparable society to handle the onslaught. Americans have a long history of assuming that we have nothing to learn from other nations. And today we are paying for it. Black and brown Americans are suffering the most, as usual, from American exceptionalism. Then came the specter of yet another Black American brutalized to death as though his life did not matter. The murder of George Floyd was a terrible reminder that no vaccine is on the way for anti-Black racism. He was cut down in a terribly similar manner to so many others. Ahmaud Arbery, Sandra Bland, Michael Brown, Terrence Crutcher, Eric Garner, Oscar Grant, Freddie Gray, Botham Jean, Tatiana Jefferson, Betty Jones, Trayvon Martin, Laquan McDonald, Tamir Rice, Breonna Taylor, Dominique White. Martin Luther King Jr. famously asked, "What is it that America has failed to hear?" He answered that as long as America postpones justice and fails to reckon with its history, it is bound to relive the cycle of trauma, rage, violence, and riots over and over again. Today, I am going to linger over the crises of anti-Black racism and economic injustice that founded social gospel movements on both sides of the color line over a century ago, which founded the field that I teach, social ethics. But a crisis is a crisis partly because it defies certainty, confident speaking, thinking that you know the answer. In 1910, W.E.B. Du Bois founded Crisis magazine as the flagship of the newly founded NAACP. He had no idea if it would succeed. He quit his job at Atlanta University and dragged his family to New York with no guarantee of a salary. Du Bois had just failed crushingly in his previous venture, the Niagara Movement. Before that, the Afro-American Council had failed, and before that, the Afro-American League had failed. Founding Crisis magazine was a desperation move for Du Bois. After World War I, when theologians began to hold conferences again, they repudiated the language of cultural progress that they learned in graduate school. Western civilization and modern thought were in crisis, they said. The first name of the dialectical theology movement that formed around Karl Barth was crisis theology. It was a reaction to the slaughter of World War I and the imperial hubris that produced it. Modern theology had sanctified the conceits of bourgeois culture. Crisis theology was about shattered illusions, the experience of emptiness before a hidden God, and what Barth called the unexpected surge of spiritual meaning he found in the strange new world within the Bible. Barth said that before the kingdom of God can become real to modern people, there must come a crisis that denies all human thought. But you cannot write systematic theology on that basis. Barth later acknowledged that crisis theology was too infatuated with its rhetoric of crisis and too eager to theologize it. I do not know how to frame the multi-layered crisis of our time. I only know that we are living through a terrible period of reaction based on backlash movements against people of color, immigrants, feminists, gay and queer persons, and every liberationist movement of the past half century. And now we're in a phase when systemic injustices are stripped bare for everyone to see. When such a moment occurs, new possibilities are realistic. Paul Tillich, in 1920, recycled a Greek word to name such a time as this. Kairos, he said, the right time, named the post-war moment when new things were possible. Tillich preferred the term kairos theology over crisis theology because theology has to be geared to the redemptive possibilities. Americans have long debated two fundamentally different visions of the kind of country we should want to be. The first is the vision of a society that provides unrestricted liberty to acquire wealth, lifts the right to property above the right to self-government, and protects the interests of established elites in the name of individual freedom. The second is the vision of a realized democracy in which democratic self-government is superior to property and no group dominates any other. The social gospel of the Gilded Age emphatically espoused the latter vision. In white churches, it was principally a response to industrialization and the corruption of the Gilded Age. The white social gospel recovered the social justice emphasis of Hebrew scripture and the centrality of the kingdom of God in the teaching of Jesus. It created the ecumenical movement and put social justice on its agenda. The social gospel that arose in Black churches was a struggle for a new abolitionism. It arose as a response to the abandonment of Reconstruction and an upsurge of racial terrorism. The Black social gospel enlisted the churches in the struggle to build protest organizations against Jim Crow. It paved the way to the civil rights movement, the greatest story we have in this country, providing the social justice theology of the civil rights movement. Both of these social gospel traditions had democratic socialist flanks led by prominent figures. These Christian socialist movements were the wellsprings of liberation theology, showing that struggles for economic justice and racial justice can fold together and must. The mainstream of the white social gospel did not give high priority to racial justice. But there was a neo-abolitionist flank that pushed hard for it. And many years ago, it caught my attention that these white social gospel neo-abolitionists were nearly always socialists, feminists, and anti-imperialists. Notably, Albion Tourgay, George Gates, George Herron, Mary White Ovington, W.D.P. Bliss, Vita Scudder, Celia Woolley, Walter Mulder. Similarly, the Black social gospel had a reformist mainstream and a socialist flank that opposed all sites of oppression. Foremost among the Black Christian socialists were Reverend Ransom, George W. Woodby, George Slater, Robert Bagnall, George Fraser Miller, Mordecai Johnson, Benjamin Mays, and Pauli Murray, until Martin Luther King Jr. came along. On both sides of the color line, it was not a coincidence that the social gospel, social ethics, sociology, the other social sciences, socialism, and the ideas of social structure, social salvation, and social justice all arose at the same time. Also, corporate capitalism, the trade unions, and the first organizations devoted to racial justice. The social gospel idea of social salvation rested on the emerging sociological idea of social structure, which gave rise to the idea of social justice. The social gospel was precisely the claim that Christianity has a mission to transform the structures of society in the direction of social justice. This sentence was impossible before the 1880s, when nobody knew there's such a thing as social structure. In the social gospel, society became a subject of redemption. Social justice became intrinsic to salvation. The church began to say that salvation must be personal and social to be saving. A bad society makes ordinary people do bad things. A good society makes selfish people less selfish and violent. Christian socialist movements arose in Europe during the same period. And the key difference between them and the American social gospel was not socialism. Nearly the entire American movement supported producer cooperatives and the socialization of natural monopolies, even as much of the movement avoided the S word. The American difference was that the social gospel was an evangelical earthquake that should be called the Third Great Awakening. It preached that America had fallen into corruption and only a spiritual awakening would save it from its sins. The middle-class ministers who founded the white social gospel burned with shame at being criticized by the Knights of Labor, a radical Christian industrial union with no color bar. The Knights arose in the 1870s and had almost 1 million members by 1886. They were predominantly Protestant until Catholics poured into the union in the mid-1880s. The Knights blasted the churches for siding with the ruling class, but they got pulled into too many strikes and were violently suppressed by state militias. Then they were surpassed by the American Federation of Labor, AFL, a federation of mostly conservative, racist, sexist craft unions that barred Black Americans, women, and entire categories of immigrants, especially Asians. The rise of the AFL was a colossal victory for racist divide and conquer in this country. Meanwhile, the founders of the Black social gospel were compelled to ask what a new abolitionism would be. They were an embattled minority in their own denominations because the social gospel was divisive and it got people in trouble. The founders fought hard for the right to advocate progressive theology and social justice politics. To them, the crisis was the plague of white terrorism and disenfranchisement that began during Reconstruction. The Black founders were succeeded by figures that espoused social gospel theology from the beginning of their careers. Johnson, Mays, Howard Thurman, J. Pius Barber, the role models for King, who did not come from nowhere. King was steeped in a Black social gospel that sang and preached and marched to redeem this country. When lightning struck in Montgomery, Alabama in December 1955, King had a freshly minted Ph.D. from Boston University, and he imagined how his role models would respond to this moment. He preached that God is the personal ground of the infinite value of human personality. If the worth of personality is the ultimate value in life, America's racial caste system was distinctly evil. Evil is that which degrades personality, the sacred dignity of every human life. If Christianity meant anything in the USA, it had to shout against racism. The movement made King, not the other way around. But the movement that swept him to prominence would not have caught fire without him. For a while, the movement floundered, even as King became famous. King was sensitive and peaceable. He talked about Gandhi, but it repulsed him to imagine that he would get people killed. It took the student sit-in explosion of 1960 to push King into actual Gandhian disruption and going to jail. King decided that he needed to raise hell in the most hostile cities he could find, so he selected lieutenants who were willing to do it. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference was a fire alarm outfit relying on street theater and heroic agitation, long on male ministers who did not treat their female allies with the respect they deserved. And King was no exception. King got more radical and angry every year. And by the end, he was more of both than anybody around him. Alex Haley asked him in 1964 what his biggest mistake had been. King said it was overestimating the spiritual integrity of white ministers. After Selma, King dragged the movement to Chicago and got pelted with rocks. He frightened and appalled the civil rights establishment by opposing the war in Vietnam. He dragged his lieutenants into the poor people's movement, and they were all opposed to him. At the end, King was unfathomably exhausted and depressed. But he said he dared not give up hope, because that is not an ethical option. This tradition of Black social gospel Christianity is ongoing, building on the social gospel and liberationist movements of the past and present. Today, when you go to a Black Lives Matter demonstration, you meet a lot of people who came of age during the transition from President Obama to the current president. Obama was careful, supremely gifted, and very soon frustrated. He was a good president who could have been better, but all of that became secondary to the pathos of his presidency. Obama sowed a ferocious, titanic backlash merely by living in the White House and doing his job. Every day that he served, he made this country look better than it was. There has never been a breakthrough for racial justice in the USA that did not set off a backlash of rage and alienation. Many of you came of age when idealistic talk about a post-racial future gave way to anxious talk about losing our way. Then it became undeniable that America has not overcome its history. Many white churches are trying for the first time to have a conversation about their own racism. For decades, they pleaded, "We're so welcoming and we want to be diverse. Why are we so white?" Finally, they are getting past that stage. But the next stage is painful, and people recoil from it. White fragility is hair trigger and self-protective. Many of us were taught that racism is essentially a problem of racial bias, a prejudice to overcome. 2 years ago, a Starbucks employee in Philadelphia called the police because 2 Black men were sitting in the store waiting for a friend to arrive. Starbucks closed its doors for 4 hours to conduct what he had called a racial bias education day. Well, you have to start somewhere, and at least they did it, while customers pounded on the doors, demanding their frappuccinos. But fixing on racial bias is only a starting point. People do not admit to being racially biased, and the bias concept reinforces the race-blind idea of racial justice. Racism as bias yielded generations of white liberals who claimed that the most anti-racist thing they could do was to ignore race altogether. Howard Thurman's spiritual mentor, Quaker theologian Rufus Jones, refused to say anything about racism, even as he wrote prolifically about peace and the inner light. He reasoned that race is a baleful category, so just pay it no mind. My students cannot believe that these ignore-it-away liberals were sincere. I work hard at trying to explain it. It is possible to be courageous about racial justice while holding this view. John Haynes Holmes and some of the white feminist social workers who helped to found the NAACP were race-blind liberals. Du Bois fought with them, but he also respected them. The biased view produces sincere reductionists who just want to be blameless. White supremacy is a structure of power based on racial privilege that presumes to define what is normal and good. For 18 years, I taught at a liberal arts college that I love dearly, and which was very much like many others. We struggled to attract Black and Asian students and faculty. We did even worse at recruiting Latinx students and faculty. And we outright failed to retain African American faculty. Some of us took part in anti-racism workshops, confessed our racism, and thought, okay, now we're getting somewhere. But nothing really changed, even if entire departments went to the workshops. One year, we lost 80% of our African American faculty. Why was this happening? It was tempting to blame the colleagues who pined for the white male monoculture of the past, but the college made a strong commitment to multiculturalism. The opposition decreased through retirements, and we still lost Black colleagues. On their way out, they said, "This place is so white, I can't breathe here." Finally, our group of workshop veterans began to interrogate the culture of whiteness. This was harder and way more painful than the anti-bias approach, but it exposed the structures of privilege that insulated our existence. White culture is transparent to white persons wherever they are dominant. It's hard to see because it's everything that's not specifically African American culture, Latinx culture, and so on. If you live in this society without being constantly reminded of your race and don't have to worry about representing your race and don't have to worry about the police, you are a beneficiary of it. The work of recent years in religious communities, in schools, in civic organizations, and the media is beginning to pay off. Look at the crowds that have gathered this year to protest against anti-Black racism. We have never seen anywhere near this many white people willing to put themselves out there, and that's in the middle of a pandemic. This is a kairos moment for all of its terror when new things are possible. I began on a personal note about Anglican things, and I'm going to swing back to it here at the end. I grew up in a poor, semi-rural, nominally Catholic family in mid-Michigan, Bay County. My parents moved there after growing up in similarly poor areas of Michigan's Upper Peninsula, where my father took abuse for being Native American. He had sisters who could not have passed anywhere as racially indeterminate, but he moved to the Lower Peninsula to acquire passively white status. When my father looked in the mirror, he saw an inferior caste. So the most loving thing he could imagine was to claim for his children all the white privilege he could get for them. In his later life, he could not have passed. And I am grateful that he was able to reclaim his Native American heritage. But I was raised in white privilege and have never claimed any other identity. In my youth, I got to church occasionally, just enough to be caught by the figure of the crucified Jesus. What kind of religion says that God suffered and died on a cross? That was my first theological question. It was a sign of transcendence that broke through my everyday horizon of lower class culture and the next game. Then the stunning witness of the civil rights movement similarly broke through. My teachers described America as the world's greatest nation in every way that mattered and the greatest ever. That was hard to square with the spectacle of the civil rights movement. King became the formative figure for me before I understood much of anything about politics or religion. And when he was assassinated, the Christian cross story and the King story folded together in my thought and feeling. In my 20s and early 30s, I was a solidarity organizer, playing leadership roles in 3 social justice organizations. My wife, Brenda, was a Presbyterian pastor, and I belatedly joined the Episcopal Church at the age of 28. I was reading a lot of William Temple at the time, and his books lured me into Anglicanism. Plus, Brenda said, "It's nice that you're going to join a church, just don't join my church." Temple was a neo-Hegelian theologian and a theorist of economic democracy. It delighted me that somebody besides me combined these intellectual passions. He was also spiritually deep and eloquent, a light to many. Temple grew up as privileged as you could get in England, yet it was not a barrier between us. He has influenced both sides of my work, the theological, philosophical side and the ethical, political side, and I find Temple to be characteristically wise on the subject of crisis. He believed that theology must speak to the crisis of its time without fixating on crisis itself. In his early career, Temple wrote books on the side while serving as a pastor. His books refashioned Anglican Logos theology in Hegelian terms. Spirit is the nature of the supreme reality that created all things, a real source and cause of process. The will of Christ is one with the will of God and expressive of it, but not identical with it. Will and personality are ideally interchangeable terms. Love divine creates and calls out from created things the love that all things were created to be and to express. The Temple, Karl Barth was too narrow, confining theology to sola scriptura and a wholly other God. And Karl Marx was too narrow, fixing wholly on capitalist exploitation. Yet Barth and Marx were powerful thinkers who changed how theologians and socialists understood their subjects. Temple refused to believe that you have to be one-sided to speak with convicting power. Surely, theology should aspire to a comprehensive dialectic that interprets everything, employing all the disciplines. In the 1930s, Temple fused classic Logos theology, Hegel, Christian socialism, and Alfred North Whitehead to that end. He appropriated the organic realism of Whitehead as a corrective to the idealist approach of beginning with the mind and its ideas. All apprehension is of objects and is interpretive from the beginning. The mind emerges through the process of apprehensions and adjustments that it apprehends. The fact that the world gives rise to minds that apprehend the world tells us something important about the world. There is a deep kinship between mind and the world. Mind and matter are related dialectically. The relative flux of matter lacks a self-explanatory principle, while mind has the principle of purpose or rational choice. Since there is no materialist explanation of mind, it is reasonable to believe that the mind contains the explanation of the world process. If mind is part of nature, nature must be grounded in mind. Otherwise, nature could not contain it. In theological terms, the world has an immanent reason, a logos. If this principle is impersonal, it's a principle of logical coherence. If it's personal, it is purposive, moral, spiritual, and a principle of variation. For personality, whether human or divine, is immersed in the world process at the level of immanent reason. Temple was fond of saying that all existence is a medium of revelation, the actuality of the relationship between nature, humanity, and God. Revelation is the coincidence of event and appreciation, the apprehension by a mind arising out of the world process of the process for what it is. Divinity, self-expressed. It is like beauty in being revelatory only when apprehended. Temple felt in the 1930s that the world was going to hell. But the answer was not in the sola scriptura theologies propounded by Barth and 13 kinds of neo-orthodoxy. To give up on a theology of manifestation meant that theologies could only speak past and against each other. There had to be a basis for renewing classic philosophical theology. In his last years, Temple said the same thing about economic democracy. I don't have time to go there, except to say that William Temple was far ahead of his time and of ours. In his book, The Hope of a New World, which he published just before he became Archbishop of Canterbury, Temple called for an excess profits tax on major company profits payable in the form of shares to worker funds. These funds, over time, would gradually gain partial or full democratic control over major enterprises. 40 years later, the Swedish Union movement embraced this proposal. It was called the Meidner Plan for Economic Democracy, with no mention of Temple. The Meidner Plan got a 10-year run in Sweden, where it worked perfectly well, except politically. Conservatives and big business railed against it constantly, loathing the very idea of economic democracy. And in 1992, they got rid of it. That is the closest that any nation has come to democratizing major enterprises on a national scale. Today, the plan originated by Temple is the gold standard of economic democracy theory. Economic democracy on this scale is way out there beyond our horizon. But on a smaller scale, it is the everyday struggle to expand the cooperative sector and extend the values of democracy into economic structures. It builds institutions that don't belong wholly to the capitalist market or the state. Producer and consumer cooperatives, community land trusts, worker co-determination, community finance corporations. In the USA, the corporate sector decimated our manufacturing base by exporting jobs with a frenzy that made a few people rich and caused colossal devastation. In Germany, they did not wipe out their manufacturing base because Germany has worker co-determination on every company board. Workers don't throw away their own jobs. Yardstick public corporations are another model and form of economic democracy. A publicly owned bank or pharmaceutical company or health insurer can measure what the market actually requires in industries that tend to become oligopolies. I have devoted 45 years to this work of building democratic and ecological economic alternatives. Much of it was very lonely, and I am thrilled to see what is coming in the new social movements. In Hebrew and Christian scripture, the test of ethical action is how it affects the struggles of oppressed and excluded peoples. We need new forms of community that forge ties of solidarity and that abolish racism, sexism, and the denigration of gay, lesbian, trans, and queer persons. I am for anything that helps us renew our seminaries and churches for an imperiled world. We need to uphold the best of our traditions in a way that is global, intercultural, eco-feminist, and engaged in interfaith activism. The love ethic of Jesus makes you care, makes you angry, throws you into the struggle, keeps you in it, reminds you that we are not in control, helps you face another day. I grieve for those of you who are struggling just to get through the next day and the next day of this strange, traumatizing, in many ways, brutal time. But I also envy you for beginning your ministries in a time of thriving social movements and kairos possibilities. Blessings, my friends, and thank you.
I want to thank Professor Dorian for that extraordinary lecture we just heard. And as an illustration of that capacity to summarize complex thinkers so eloquently, I mean, that discourse on William Temple, you had the entire corpus covered in minutes in a way that was compelling and visionary and you know, remarkable. So it really has been an honor to be part of this lecture today. So now we open up our session to questions. The professor's with us to provide answers. And you can either use the chat or you can use the Q&A. I did see Doug Heiser, he put his hand up at one point. I think it's actually when William Temple was being mentioned. So you might want to type your question into the chat, Doug, if you still want to share it. But I'm open now for questions either in the Q&A or into the chat. And there we have our first question. And Professor Dorian, I trust you can see the question yourself, but let me just share it with you. The question is, will you please share your thoughts about what is causing the rise of white nationalists and supremacists in today's society?
Thank you, Ian. Thank you for those remarks and for this wonderful opportunity and for that question. I do think that the key thing in trying to get our arms around this very difficult and terrible question is to take the opportunity it affords to us to deal with its long time coming, with the fact that yes, you can point to a point here and there in our own lifetime or in our own recent political history or the like. We are inclined to do this. We need sort of narratives that we can sort of handle and get our arms around and that feel manageable and the like. And it can feel depressing, too much to deal with. If the explanation is in fact too big or too long running, all of that can get in the way, it feels, of having real ethical and political agency. And yet I do risk all of that in the name of the very sort of question that I sort of posed from Dr. King before, that backlash moments like the one we are in now do give us an opportunity to deal with something that didn't just start yesterday or 5 years ago or 10 years ago or 30 years ago, that we are in fact dealing with the consequences, the ravages of the racial caste system in this country, with 246 years of chattel slavery and 100 years of Jim Crow and all that sort of came from just the impacted hostility and rage and difficulty that's just in that history. I should say also, I also do see it happening. I wanted to make sure, I said that here, that I think we're in a moment right now when we have religious communities and other kinds of communities that are open to this way of interrogating our history in a way that is new. We've never, certainly in my lifetime, I've never seen anything close to what has happened this year in interrogating white supremacy as a structure of power based on racial privilege that presumes to define what's normal and good. And I think it can even be, in some ways, as I tried to indicate, I think in some ways it's even it's more constructive. It gets you somewhere in dealing with the question far more than that bias question ever did. But it does require engaging a long history that we didn't create, that we are now just part of and implicated in.
Thank you very much for that reply. There's another question here. As we deal with decreasing church attendance in the Episcopal Church, is the social gospel a helpful ally in evangelism or harmful? Martin Luther King Jr. has been secularized along with much of the tenets of the social gospel. I'm thinking the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So does a focus on the social gospel lead to church growth, or is it a factor in our decline as a denomination?
Thank you. From the beginning of the emergence of social gospel movements on both sides of the color line, it was always charged. This was always a concern that it could be a way of simply undercutting Christian witness, that it's sort of changing, certainly to many people, it's changing the subject. It's not what the church is known for talking about or being involved in. And there is, from the beginning, all through its history on both sides, in both white church and contexts and in black church contexts, and in the ecumenical movement, which is places where these two stories have often sort of folded together. That is always a concern. And in fact, there is something in it. When the social gospel goes to seed, the times when it does in its history, it is when that sort of spiritual wellspring of what it was, what fires it, what makes it, what helps it to react, to renew the church, and to create all those peace and justice ministries that we have in the churches. What can undercut that very witness is losing the spiritual and religious wellspring from which it came. There have always been concerns that will happen, and indeed, sometimes that happens. There's something valid there, sort of to point to. However, of course, I'm on the other side of this to say this is the church being the church. That these social gospelers, they always had a battle with their own church because, well, in my New Abolition story, which was volume 1 of this trilogy, I only had one person who didn't have a battle with his own denomination over introducing social justice concerns into the preaching and witness of the church. And that was Alexander Walters, who was a wonderful AME Zion bishop. And for him, it was just, they just loved on him all the way. Made bishop early and doesn't have this battle. Everyone else in that founding Black social gospel story has got a battle with his own church. Because as I said, yeah, the social gospel can get you in trouble. And it can seem divisive, and for many, it's changing the subject. And there's this threat of a loss of a certain sort of spiritual center. And yet, of course, what these social gospelers always said was that, no, we are not known for certain things. I mean, we are not known for being involved in struggles for social justice, in caring for the least of these, that we have merely a kind of a charity model of dealing, of appropriating those texts in scripture. And charity is wonderful. Charity is part of the work, but it doesn't cut it. It's not nearly enough if the church is actually going to be faithful to Luke 4 and Matthew 25. And that's what will renew the church if we are known for these things. And I would say, just as a sort of kicker, my last sort of point on this run is to say that is precisely what it was in both cases. And in Black church context, the social gospel became so powerful, so important. It's just the greatest story we have in this country religiously. And now we have people who don't know if the Black churches have ever been anything else, which, is its own problem when you just think, oh, that's what the Black churches have always been. No, this had to be fought for there. And the same thing on the side of white ecumenical Protestantism. It was this social gospel movement that created the ecumenical movement. It was far more than whatever detractive impulsion it might have in it. It was a powerful motive force in the churches. As I said, back in the day, it really should be called the Third Great Awakening. And it is, I think, when the church is involved in ecumenical work, anytime it binds together to do community organizing or any of that kind of work that the church does, it's always got the social gospel behind it, in it.
Thank you for that rich answer. Now the questions are coming in hard and fast. I'm going to try and group them. I'm going to save the one on the seminaries towards the end, given that's very much close to home. Let's take the one from Sarah Coakley, who addresses her question saying, "Dear Gary, thank you for your brilliant, moving and incisive survey of the history and current state of American racism. At one point you remarked that it's, quote, hard to see how the, quote, whiteness paradigm could be interrupted. In your view, how does the interrogation of white supremacy as a structure of power require a depth of perception that is not merely intellectual, educational, or even political? What sort of church practices could possibly assist at the level of blindness that we're currently confronting in the denial or even the existence of systemic racism?
Well, thank you. Firstly, I just have to say I'm thrilled to be in some sort of contact here with Sarah. She's one of our greatest theologians. I've always used her work, feature it as we get near the contemporary part of our course on Anglican theology. And with regard to this very rich question, and I can't even begin to sort of get my arms around. So I'm just going to go for one thing here, and in terms of that practices point that she drives to in this very rich and many-sided question. I am a deep believer and advocate in broad-based interfaith community organizing. I do think that is the place, that is the venue in which church communities engage with religious communities and with others who are privileging certain sort of local issues of infringement, of loss of rights, of white terrorism, of just whatever it is that community ends up lifting up once you've done your every member survey and you've built your core group that has been brought together from different religious communities. I think the community organizing model, though it certainly is limited and it has trouble scaling up, and it burns people out because it can be so intentional, and the work itself is so difficult to do because it's work that hardly anywhere else does it really happen, that you are held accountable by people who are not in your particular congregation, but you built something where people from different religious congregations and then other organizations as well are binding together to do the work. So that this is the place in my experience where, better than any other kind of organizing that I know, you end up building bonds of trust across racial lines, across class lines, across lines of denomination and faith, and not just religions, but also with no religions. This is the community organizing venue, such as the work of Faith at Work or Gamaliel or DART or the other interfaith organizations that exist. So yes, I can run long on how this model, what's wrong with it, or what the limitations of it are. But so far as my own experience goes, most of my experience is with Gamaliel of the Big Four, but all of them operate in fairly similar manners, and for all the limitations they have, this is the place where this kind of work goes on like no other place I know.
Thank you for that. We've got two questions which are a little bit more individually focused. One asked the question, I'm often asked by non-religious or formerly religious young adults why the church is an institution with which a person should partner to work for justice. In the views of some of the unchurched, there are so many organizations on the ground organized around principles of justice and diversity that lack some of the baggage of Christian white supremacy. Why should we invite people to fight for justice through the church? And let's link that with the question from Doug Heiser, who shares his story. I grew up in Virginia. In my teens, I realized I was racist. I felt as a white person, I could not be anything but a racist because anyone who grew up white, male-dominated culture was basically racist. But like an alcoholic, I'm a recovering racist trying very hard to deal with and confront my racism. The first step to change is to acknowledge who I am and seek help. Can you comment on this? I'm putting the two individual human lives, and responding to that, please. One biographical and one in terms of outreach and justice.
Great, thanks. Well, thank you for these rich questions. I would say, firstly, if you find yourself in the church, if you are in fact there already, this is part of the gospel. This is Luke 4 and Matthew 25, that we're called to pour ourselves out for the least of these of my brethren. There are long stretches of the church history where it's hard to see how is it that the church is really working on that, taking seriously enough this charge that is in the gospel. But I certainly that this is part and parcel of how what I think the gospel is. And it's what Jesus talks about from the very get-go, and as how Luke, tells this story. So I do begin there. That this is the gospel mission itself. But both versions of this question did sort of have a kind of practical bent, wanting to know, well, there are other places where you could do that, right? So what if you aren't? What if you're ambivalent, or you're concerned about all the reasons why maybe you wouldn't want to bother with the church, and it hasn't called you in some way that would make you have to sort of deal with its problems. You'll just deal with some other group's problems instead. I would say this about that sort of practical bent question. The first part of it, I'll just say, this goes to even in my own experience. I was a solidarity organizer for years before I really kind of took seriously enough, really was reflective about the fact that so much of my own solidarity organizing work was occurring within religious communities, was occurring in contexts where the church was the venue. It was the place, it was the convening place. That itself, the sheer witness, the fact that churches were involved in this work had some impact on me, especially as I'm sort of asking that question about what is going to be sustaining for me over the long haul. Yes, I have all these ethical and political concerns, but what is it that's going to hold me in it over time, especially when so much of it you're feeling battered and you lose, and it's hard to see the efficacy. And that is where I want to go with this point, because whether it's about me or about so many in this work, it is something I have noticed over the years, that a high disproportionate number of people who do this work over the decades, who are just in the struggle, who don't burn out, who have a certain joy in the work, who love it, who are welcoming and opening, to others. These tend to be people who've got some spiritual wellspring. They're coming from some place and fed by something which tells them that what their life is about is trying to be faithful, not necessarily to be successful. Just the lack of a certain kind of success is not enough of a reason to opt out, because you are called to something other than just some kind of pragmatic success to begin with. I'm not saying you have to be religious. Out on the speaking trail, I have to, say this strongly, emphatically. I am not saying that. There are plenty of people who don't have it in their lives who are, iconic organizers. But I would say that it's in the greater measure. It's a highly disproportionate number of the people who hang in there for this kind of work. That they in fact have a spiritual wellspring in their lives that help them hang in there.
Thank you for that response. I'm going to link two questions around the content of your lecture together. Could you speak to King's fondness for Hegel and what might he have seen in the master-slave dialectic, particularly the master's vicarious relationship to work through the slave? So that's one question, and then I'm going to link it with Professor Mark Jefferson's question. Thank you for this informative lecture. From a Du Boisian perspective, how's the concept of the talented 10th influence the ways that a Black social imagination is evident? Are there voices beyond Du Bois' talented 10th purview to offer more radical and socially disruptive approaches to dramatic social witness? It seems to me that Du Bois often seems radical to certain liberal white sect, but for many African Americans who constitute the masses, Du Bois was not radical enough. Wow. So one on Hegel and Martin Luther King, and the other on Du Bois, please.
Oh my goodness! All right, thank you. Wow. Well, firstly, I think I'm going to cut to the quick on something on this Hegel question. I did a few months ago. I just came out with a book that is the post-Hegelian perspective that is underneath all these theological and philosophical books that I've written for many years. And I think I'll just say quickly here that I map out 6 different ways of reading Hegel, and I think they're all legitimate. I mean, I think you can get that system, that right Hegelian system view out of Hegel, and the wellspring of Marxism view, and the view that, oh no, the real Hegel, we need to just strip out all that metaphysics and just make him a phenomenologist. And other views as well, the postmodern Hegel and the like. I have respect for all of them, spend a lot of time sort of elaborating how they overlap and are, but also different from each other. I have a way of sort of reading Hegel that is very attuned to the deep sort of Christian motive sort of force in it, that I think Hegel is fundamentally a philosopher of love. Christian, I mean, it's that Christian love question. And it's in the form of a process metaphysics, a process theodicy. That, I mean, King did catch all that in Hegel. I mean, the very things that caught me about Hegel a long time ago. It took me a while later when I saw it in King as well, and then caught up on this story by not having read, Stride Toward Freedom. Realized, yes, King did his Ph.D. at Boston University, where his mentor was Edgar S. Brightman, a neo-Hegelian personalist philosopher himself of a very high-powered sort. And so the things that Brightman, that his teacher Brightman, so prized in Hegel, King caught. It's the theodicy theme. It's the theology of the cross, because you have a powerful, gripping, almost too much kind of theology of the cross in Hegel, a kind of metaphysical speculation about what it means to say that, that God in some way dies on a cross. And of course, the master-slave dialectic that you referenced sort of comes out of all of that, out of Hegelian dialectic, because Hegel has the argument, among other things, this is the argument that all consciousness is subjective, I mean, is social, that consciousness only comes into being by virtue of being engaged with an other, and that Hegel construes all that through this somewhat fanciful sort of allegory of a master and a slave. The slave becoming into consciousness by virtue of having a relationship to this master, but then becomes more human, really more elevated than the master, and the relation between those two is the foundation of Hegel's whole theory that that subjectivity is inherently and irreducibly social. Okay, enough about that, right? Yes. Du Bois and the talented 10th. Firstly, I just want to confirm everything that's in that question. I'm not interested in disputing any part of what was sort of described there with Du Bois. I would say I do think this is one of the least progressive, enabling, robust sort of aspects of Du Bois's legacy. And it does fade out. I mean, and in fact, if you put these two things together, you see Du Bois becoming more and more of a democratic socialist, as he did from 1905 on. You start to see the fading of that talented 10th conceptuality, and people are telling him, you know, this is terribly elitist, and it doesn't really go all that well with the way your own politics are shaping. And Du Bois was someone who could hear that criticism. So far as the talented 10th or conception itself is concerned, of course, he didn't invent it. This is Henry Morehouse who came up with the phrase, a great spiritual leader, a white sort of figure in the Baptist church, after whom, you know, Morehouse College is named. And for those right-leaning and even left-leaning accommodationists in the social gospel stream, I would make an exception for abolitionists. I think that's another stream, and neo-abolitionists. But for those who were in that kind of left-leaning or right-leaning accommodationist streams within the social gospel, their question was always just, but what's realistic in a country like this where we are up against it? Neo-abolitionist dreams are just too radical and too wild, and they scare people. And we have to begin where we are, which is that, yeah, the 14th and 15th Amendments have basically been lost in this country. And we need to cut to something that's really sort of achievable and small scale, and that won't scare the white people and won't cause riots and the like. And so you have these two streams of social gospel witness that are in both white churches and black churches, that are looking to get as much as you can out of some kind of accommodationist way of engaging just a profoundly difficult circumstance. And one of these strategies, it's taken me a while to get here, but one of these strategies is this talented 10th business, right? It was there's a white church version of this and a black church version as well, where people, you know, like Du Bois said, at least early in Du Bois's career, he's saying we've got to at least have a beachhead for the talented, right? That this is one of the worst parts of Booker T. Washington's legacy, that he would make fun of people like, well, Du Bois, young Du Bois, going to Harvard, getting a Ph.D. That's not what the struggle is about. And so the whole this is a slippery business, and I'm not going to try to just excuse Du Bois here, because I think Du Bois did get past this conceptuality, but there's a reason why someone who grew up when he did and went to Harvard in the 1890s and has social Darwinism all around him and is really just looking to get from here to there, to move the needle for a while. Yes, this is what he went for. That he did privilege the right to higher education in some ways over the kinds of things that Booker T is talking about, you know, just learn a trade. And that there are ways in which the argument between Du Bois versus Washington in some ways actually favored Washington. I mean, at least he's the one dealing with people who are you know, just trying to make their way. And meanwhile, you know, here's Du Bois as an academic. But I do think that there are you just have to watch this continue to develop. It's not right to just fix Du Bois at, say, 1901 or 1900, or when he wrote that essay in 1897 on the conservation of races. The way that Du Bois thinks about race continues to develop past the time when he's dealing with social Darwinism and trying to figure out himself, what he thinks about this. This is why he writes 3.5 autobiographies, because every time he rethinks how he thinks about this, he retells, he re-narrates the struggle of race in this country through his own life.
We're running out of time, sadly, and I'm very conscious that hands have been raised. Unfortunately, we don't have a mechanism for accessing raised hands. We have lots of questions still in the boxes, so I'm going to try and merge 3 of them. Okay. And you've got, I think, about 3 minutes to answer it. So okay. I'm sorry about this, but I do want to get to some of the practical questions people have asked. So I'm a white priest serving in an African-American congregation, which is now under significant pressure to become diverse, to let white people in. In our town, when white people have come over into the Episcopal African-American congregations, they take over. So I do think there's still a need for a predominantly African-American congregation, and wonder how you would approach this. What kind of theological framework would help us think this through? So hold that, and I'm going to add another. Canada is not immune from racism. The Canadians cannot understand the depth of racism, and specifically Black racism is found in the United States. In 2 weeks, I'll be transitioning to be a rector of an Episcopal church in Arizona. I want to engage the congregation on the issue of systemic racism and the need to speak on Luke 4 and Matthew 25, as you just mentioned. Any thoughts on how I could bring my engagement there? And I also want to link all that with the question, I'm concerned that the current president has banned the use of critical race theory as a way to get some of these racial biases in government agencies. His claim is that he's using this theory was destructive to racial cohesion. However, is his fear based on trying to protect his white privilege and white supremacy by denying the reality of confronting racism in our society? And I'm going to link all those 3 questions with the question, what can seminaries learn? That question came up early on. And in what sense could we be models of democratic socialist values? So 4 questions. We wrap up at 1:45. You have 2 minutes, but I might let you go over just a little bit.
Thank you, Ian. Okay. Firstly, well, for the first part, I think I'm just going to go back to my community organizing answer, because that, in fact, is the nub of it for me. If religious communities are involved in that work in community organizing, then you are building church-based movements in which we are, in fact, building relationships across the lines of race and gender and denomination and all the rest of it. And then I think as that work goes on and the churches seem to be involved in it, then you do get different dynamics. I mean, it does then kick back into congregations differently than if you're just out there on your own trying to figure out how can we be the church all by ourselves. I just don't think that works. We have to be involved with people who aren't like us, don't look like us, and then find a joy in the work. Just like you can't be Christian by yourself, I think even denomination and even congregations can't really be all that congregations can be by themselves unless they're involved in work that draws them out of themselves and with each other. I just don't think it works any other way. At least this is the way I certainly believe in. And now I'm already forgetting what those later questions were.
So the other 2 were to do with presidents banning the use of.
Yes, okay, the Trump, yes, all of that. Well, that we are in that. I mean, that is, this is terribly real. I've heard on, when you run through the channels at night, there are times when you turn on Fox and you will indeed hear critical race theory explicated in a way that is in some ways more pointed, sort of getting the point. It's not like they're always wrong. I mean, sometimes, they will explicate it in a way that is insightful, does realize that this perspective is opening up something that is hard and people resist it. And the concern is that, it's going to be divisive because it gets at people in ways that are themselves divisive. And I think we just have to work our way through to the other end of this. I would not deny that there are people making use of this. I mean, simply, looking at what's, here I am saying, yes, we have all these white people out there finally willing to put themselves out there to speak against white supremacy. To me, that's an extremely good thing, but that can also be seen to be a terribly alarming thing, and can be seen to be alarming by people who do in fact understand what it is. In some ways, for us in the church, our struggle has been to deal with people who just don't want to hear about it, right? Who just want to be nice and try to hold something together that doesn't deal with this. And I think we have to face up to it on both sides.
And I do just want to give you an opportunity to say, what lessons can seminaries learn? That was a question that also asked. So is there anything that VTS should take away from what we've heard today?
Well, I think, firstly, the church has been involved in this work for a long time. The ecumenical movement was a forerunner of it. And the ecumenical movement was deeply involved in the civil rights movement. I do think that that's the place where churches have most come to the fore. I mean, congregations themselves have never been at the forefront of this kind of activism. It's always been with, congregations hooking up with others to be involved in this work. And the same thing is true in seminaries. I think right now we are in a moment where many of us are realizing we are going to have to reinvent theological education, just ad hoc along the way. I mean, you can't, it's not like you can do it systemically or systematically, which would require putting distributive requirements and everybody's tenure and just all the stuff in play. No, we're not going to do that. We're going to have to ad hoc our way through it because certain things are harder to change. It takes a while. And yet, I think we do have to be in the mode of recognizing that we're entering a world that has changed, that is global, that we're entering a society that's not like the one that the church was involved in before. I think the church has played a role as a mediator, as just a civilizing force in this country, and sometimes as a progressive prod to be doing what society should be doing. And we do have a legacy of that. That is why I believe so strongly about that's why I take the risk of boring people by talking about this social gospel tradition, to say it's in our tradition. This isn't just something, we made up in the last few years. This has been part of our work for a long time. And we do need to rethink how we do it, because we're in a different world now.
We sadly have run out of time, and I apologize to all those whose questions we didn't get to. We do have our program continuing at 2:00 with a virtual tour of all the construction projects on the campus. But meanwhile, I want to, on behalf of everybody who participated in this webinar, just thank Dr. Dorian for what was just an extraordinary feast with depth and analysis and practical application. I freely confess, the way you handled those questions and you moved effortlessly from Hegel to practical suggestions for congregations, I was just in awe. So for the gift that you've given us today, and I so regret that I won't have the opportunity to dine with you and talk further about these questions. So I'll issue the invitation now on the understanding, I hope I can persuade you to say yes. Please do make a visit, come and see us, and we will reconnect afresh. But thank you so much for what was an outstanding presentation. We're enormously grateful. So I'm sure all the people said yes. There's lots of things going into the chat box expressing their thank you, it was wonderful, thank you for an extraordinary lecture. So that does conclude. Thank you very much, everybody.